I'm Sujai Shivakumar, Senior Fellow here at CSIS, where I direct the Renewing American Innovation program. It's my pleasure to introduce and welcome today Maryam Cope. She's a Senior Associate with our program on Renewing American Innovation, and she has long experience in the semiconductor industry with senior positions at SIA, ASML, NADCAST, and now ARM. So welcome, Maryam.
Thank you. Thank you
so
for
nice to
having
have you
me.
here. Maryam, you've written about the rise of Watt's law and why power could put a ceiling on American innovation. So this is a strategic analysis of how the shift from transistor-driven scaling is moving to power-driven scaling and what the impacts are on national security and global competitiveness. But let's sort of start at the beginning. Moore's law has sort of been driving a lot of our technological progress. Describe to me what Moore's law is and how did that impact on our innovation and our productivity?
Right, so great first question. I think it all starts with Moore's law. So Gordon Moore proposed that transistors would double every 2 years and compute power would double every 2 years. And the truth of the matter is it's driven U.S. economic growth very significantly. So this delivery of more power, more compute at less power on a very consistent basis. And so our U.S. ecosystem and global ecosystem has began to expect sort of a reliable delivery of better compute at lower power. And that really reflects itself in our economic growth. So the Federal Reserve did a study from 1960 to 2019. They believe that anywhere between 12 to 20% of U.S. Macroeconomic growth was due to Moore's law. So it's not an insignificant principle, and it's changing now that AI compute is moving to the fore.
But again, keeping with Moore's law, you mentioned the economic and the macroeconomic growth. How is Moore's law impacting our national security capabilities?
So Moore's law was tremendously powerful for the national security apparatus in general because a number of things sort of compounded across various areas. One, it was a great source of U.S. economic growth, so extended U.S. Economic capacity. Second is from the national security perspective, there was cryptography, geolocation, modeling, targeting, all sorts of ways to use this technology that was getting stronger and stronger every year. And so a lot of military businesses, commercial off-the-shelf providers of technology to the U.S. government all sort of planned around the continuing iterations of Moore's law. So really all of our systems, all of our policymaking decisions have thus far been made around Moore's law and continuing to get better compute at lower cost.
And yet now Moore's law is under challenge, and you argue that AI is challenging. Why is this traditional model of computing performance failing modern AI?
Yeah, the change from Moore's law to what I describe in the paper as Watt's law is really driven by a number of factors. One is the compute architecture change. So Moore's law sort of transitioned into something called Dennard scaling, which was really the increasing transistor density on the chip. And that was really driven by innovations in how you make a chip, how you scale production of a chip, those types of things. And so that sort of started petering out in the mid-2000s. And then the semiconductor industry moved to moving things on more towards packaging, trying to have various accelerators on the chip. But then the rise of AI compute, it's a totally new architecture. And it really relies on much more than transistor scaling to be able to achieve growth in compute. And growth in compute in the context of this paper is, and we'll talk about this more, is tokens per watt. So that's a very different architecture altogether. And it's different both at the data center and at the edge. It's different all the way across the whole ecosystem. And so as we transition to that, policymakers really need to think about how does that change our policymaking goals.
So am I hearing you correct that technical hardware progress is now perhaps more important than shrinking transistors?
I believe so.
Yeah,
And I don't want to undercount shrinking transistors. I think transistor shrink will continue to contribute to advancing compute at lower energy costs. But the truth of the matter is it's now memory, it's interconnects, optical interconnects, it's networking, it's how you run the whole system as a whole, because these AI factories really are industrial assets. So they go from you really are going from a CPU that's doing a lot of individual compute where you would like to see what's the peak amount of performance on that CPU to now these massive parallel processes where it's really an always-on industrial process where you're trying to maximize efficiency and generation of tokens.
So are we ready to play the taps for Moore's law, or what's the future now for that part of that dynamic?
Well, I think Moore's law is still important. Again, I think it's a factor, but I think power availability, growth and power availability is now on an equal footing with the technical growth that we're going to see. And even that technical growth is coming much more from, like I said, design, interconnects, system utilization, software innovation. So it's sort of a full stack innovation process that's happening now in these AI factories.
So you talk about Watt's law. So first of all, what is Watt's law?
Watt's law is a proposal, so welcome feedback on the paper. But what it proposes is that growth in power delivery and growth in technical innovation actually will result in growth, exponential growth in tokens per watt. And so tokens per watt is some entities use it to try to measure AI output. Some entities use flops per dollar. After looking at all of the available data, tokens per watt seemed like the measurement that could most accurately cover all of the AI capabilities in these AI factories.
And so is that the new metric to keep track of Watt's law?
Yes, yes.
And so then what is the tipping point in terms of industrial policy where actually we move from, move into where infrastructure policy sort of becomes industrial policy or innovation policy in a sense?
Well, if you take, so the US has really excelled at the innovation part of this whole ecosystem. The semiconductor was invented in the United States. We continue to have fantastic semiconductor designs originating from the United States. We have onshore manufacturing of leading edge semiconductors thanks to the CHIPS Act. So that whole portion is still incredibly important, but we've added a new factor to it, which is how quickly can you increase power supply to these AI factories? So you have the technical component, and then you have this power generation component that also includes connecting and utilizing the power into the AI factory.
So power is a new binding constraint.
It is a new binding constraint. That is correct. That's what the paper proposes.
Yeah, and how is industry reacting to this new development?
Well, it's really interesting because I think industry as a whole has sort of understood that this is going on at a fundamental level. And so if you take a look at the recent news, a recent report came out that 30% of all new data centers proposed in this past year are actually going to use behind the grid energy. So that's energy that's not, it's privately generated energy. It's based off of what you as a developer for a data center or AI factory can bring to the grid. And so that is actually an incredible amount of megawatts and gigawatts that are being done privately. And so I think it's really this understanding amongst those who are setting up this AI infrastructure that they need to be able to have access to power in order to be able to maximize their AI performance, their AI training, their AI diffusion, all of those things.
So you're suggesting that some of the bottlenecks are, in terms of are more infrastructural than perhaps technological.
Yes, right? And that's a major change because before it was really about having the best chip, and that's it. And now it's really about, can you set up a system, utilize it incredibly efficiently, generate as many tokens per watt as possible to address your AI question of concern, and how much power can you use to get that to its max capability, and how efficiently can you do it? So that means that you're covering generators, you're covering batteries, you're covering interconnect on the grid, transformers, things that typically wouldn't be part of what a semiconductor company would be concerned with. But now these AI companies that also design semiconductors are looking at the whole stack, and they're also looking at this energy question.
So let's sort of turn to what does this mean for policy, and what does it mean? How do policymakers come to understand what the stakes are here? So where are we in that understanding? In your opinion, is it something that we have to sort of start working on?
Many of the senior industry executives have pointed out that this is a problem in a relatively neutral fashion, but they increasingly are sounding somewhat alarmed in the press that we really need to make sure that the United States is able to provide the power that needs for the new AI compute infrastructure that's springing up across the United States. Otherwise, we'll be limiting how much we can use that capability. But it's very interesting because policymakers are moving on regulatory reform, permitting. I think state utilities are having very blunt conversations with folks as they try to figure out the amount of generation they can provide and how quickly they can interconnect. But at the federal level and sort of as a across the government strategy, I think it's really a patchwork of understanding. There's not a sort of a holistic view of how do we approach this from the idea that AI is a strategic national asset.
So, a lot of the policy discussions in town have been focusing on export controls as, because that's referring to the older paradigm rather than the one that you see very rapidly emerging. Are we talking about something that is really not that relevant anymore?
Well, export controls are always going to be important to national security. So, but if you look at Watt's law, what you can see emerging is that export controls actually turn into a bit of a cost tax instead of a choke point. So, a country with very cheap and abundant energy can use that cheap and abundant energy to sort of hook together lesser quality or less powerful AI, chips to get AI systems, and then use these other factors as well as the cheap and abundant power to be able to have a full stack that is somewhat equivalent to what we have in leading U.S.
So if you
AI
think
factories.
about China, we are trying to deny them some of the most advanced chips, but what you're suggesting is that if they get their infrastructure act together, they can actually overcome this handicap that we're trying to put on them.
I still think it's to be determined, but the truth of the matter is that these export controls with the emergence of Watt's law are a moat. They're a time buying strategy. They, actors adapt. And so these choke points that were very effective under the Moore's law regime will become just less effective as we move to this new AI compute paradigm.
Yeah. So what do you suggest in terms of U.S. policy? How should we? It's a sort of a challenge, but it's also an opportunity because we're sort of making this shift from one law to the other, from Moore's law to Watt's law. We talked about some of the challenges in terms of, yes, we need to build out our infrastructure. How else does this open the game up, if you will?
Well, the paper talks a lot about the downsides, but I do want to talk about the upsides because I think it's really important to focus on those as well. So this is a once-in-a-generation opportunity. You don't typically have whole technological paradigms happen at such a fast clip. And so whatever export control policy we have absolutely needs to be paired with an extremely robust domestic build-out policy. And those two things need to happen with the same speed. And so it's easy to just hope that our technological process and our technological prowess will get us to where we need to be on AI. But the truth of the matter is, because of Watt's law, that's not the case. We also have to get this interconnect, this power generation, get these AI factories online and very quickly. So I think we really should have some moonshot goals about how much power availability that we are able to bring online in the United States to support this AI infrastructure. And then secondly, the paper does recommend that the president utilize the PCAS, the President's Council of Advisors on Science and Technology, to do a yearly report and find out, are we meeting the needs of the AI infrastructure leaders in the country? And also, I think thirdly, we really need to think through our the foreign policy impacts of this. So if we have allies that are very energy rich, they might be ideal allies for our AI supply chain.
And we also talked about, we started this conversation about the economic and productivity gains that comes from Moore's law. What are the advantages here and how should we press for them?
Well, it's really interesting because some in industry believe that what could be called Watt's law will far outstrip Moore's law. So the exponential gains will be almost unpredictably fast. And I think that's incredibly exciting for areas where the US has lost its strategic advantage. So there are many areas where competitor nations have been filing more patents than us, in biotech, in analog devices, in various items that are just really important to our national resilience. And so AI can really supercharge R&D in that space and do things like lab in the loop or virtual labs. We saw that with Operation the COVID vaccine. So I think that there's a lot of opportunity there. So we could have another macroeconomic tailwind with AI diffusing into the economy that we really want to be able to take advantage of.
Well, I think this report that will be published, I think tomorrow by CSIS, really underlines what the challenge is and what we need to be doing to get our act together, if you will. So thank you so much for joining us, and thank you, Maryam, for this conversation today.
Thank you for having me.
Of course.